Hello and welcome back once again to Southbank Live, the show where we discuss some of the important market trends that have gone on over the past week and which you may not have been hearing about quite so much from the mainstream news and indeed from mainstream investment websites. My name is Boaz Shoshan, and for the show, I've got Kit Winder on, our energy specialist at Southbank Investment Research. Kit, how are you getting on this evening?
Yeah, good. Thanks, Baz. How are you?
Not too bad, not too bad. Of course, this is the second show we've done this week. We've not done that one before. Due to the crisis in Ukraine, we got John Butler on Tuesday to discuss what's going on over in Ukraine now that war has been declared. Very grim and somber subject to be discussing, but one that's, of course, very, very important to investors today. Indeed, earlier today, I saw I think it was on a Russian business TV channel where the news anchor is asking one of their Russian analysts what they make of the action in the stock market, and he brings up a bottle and drinks a toast, saying, "Well, stock market, you were interesting, but now it's all over." Very grim times for investors. Though, of course, there's a war going on, which is an order of magnitude more grim. But anyway, welcome to everybody who has tuned in this evening. Sorry if the timing keeps changing for when we do these shows. I know not everyone can do our normal 7 p.m. slot, and this time around we can do our 7 p.m. slot. So this is at 6 p.m. this time. Hope everybody is having a nice evening, or as nice as one can in these circumstances. Kit, plenty for us to discuss at the minute. Recently, you've been talking about something you called New World investing. Would you like to give us an idea of what New World investing is?
Yeah, sure. I think this sort of comes out of the focus that I've had in the last few years, looking at the energy transition. So looking at us moving away from fossil fuels, which are a commodity, to things like solar power and wind power, which are a technology. And the incredible thing that's happened in that sector is that over the last decade, I think the costs of producing solar power have come down 80%. The cost of producing wind power have come down 50%, and the cost of producing batteries have come down around 90% as well. And that incredible cost reduction, because there's a learning curve associated with that technology, have allowed them to, undercut fossil fuels. So now renewables are cheaper than gas and coal-fired electricity in sort of, 2/3 of the world. And to be honest, that's an old stat. That's a couple of months old. And so now, with the way gas prices are going and the way coal prices have gone, it's probably something like 90% of the world. And what this is doing is it's just unlocking decarbonisation actually beyond the energy industry. And we're starting to see companies in whatever sector they are: aviation, steel, cement making, food production, transportation, mining, metals mining, gold and silver, whatever it is, you name it. This incredible, source of cheap, clean, flexible electricity is allowing companies to decarbonize across the global economy. And I think one thing that really triggered uh, this idea for me, this new world idea of the whole global economy moving to a sort of sustainable operating model, was when I started looking for the first time into something called cultivated meat. And cultivated meat is where you take some live cells from an animal and you start growing them in a lab. And a number of people that we know have sort of gone vegetarian and vegan, and they are eating all of the sort of alternative proteins, which are made from pea and soy and whatever else you name it. Beyond Meat and Impossible Foods are the two main purveyors of that particular product. But cultivated meat is something else entirely. When you think about, uh,
It's the
the amount,
Frankenstein stuff, right?
this is the Frankenstein stuff. But when you think about the fact that it takes something like 90% less energy, less time, and less water to grow a chicken breast or a hamburger in a lab from cells that it does with, by growing, cutting down a forest to grow some soy, to rear a baby cow for months and months on end, giving it water to drink and food to eat every single day, keeping it warm at night and sheltered, whatever it is. The potential to massively reduce land, energy, and water use is incredible. And the problem has been cost. And I mentioned the learning rates of the technologies in energy. And what really triggered this sort of new world investing idea was when I saw that the learning rates for cultivated meat are incredible. I think in 2013, the first ever cultivated hamburger, it took sort of $1.2 million to create, because it was the first one ever and there was no technology and no process to do it. And then a number of years later, they'd got it down to 100,000. And then a number of years later, it was down to 10. And then sort of 3 years ago, it was still $1,000 to make, an ounce, a 2 ounce handbag or however heavy they are. But then by last year, it was down to $50, and already there are people talking about $25 and $30 per ounce cultivated meat. And that incredible learning curve is faster than the internet, and it's faster than a number of other technologies which have been incredibly disruptive to the industries that they've gone into. And it's a lot faster than solar and wind have been. And I just suddenly had this realization that decarbonization is coming for all these other sectors if they are operating through technological disruption. And it's this real story of climate tech above all that is now taking place across sectors to help them decarbonize their own operations, their own sectors.
Yeah, it's a very interesting dynamic, this war on carbon idea. As you say, it does play out across all manner of different sectors. It's funny, I think the cultivated meat example is quite interesting because it's quite polarizing, the kind of people who are interested in eating cultivated meat. I mean, I'm actually a vegetarian, and I've been raised vegetarian all my life. I've only more recently, started eating more meat, and it wasn't an ethical thing. It's just because I was raised that way, and whenever I had meat in the past, it just tasted like a fake version of the fake meat that you would normally get, right? However, I would probably be more likely to eat an actual steak than a cultivated one. I think there's just something about it that doesn't quite do it for me. I just in terms of the way they're created. But of course, some of us are more open-minded to this kind of thing. I mean, Kit, do you think it's an advertising problem that is getting in the way here?
Yeah, advertising maybe. I think what you say is completely natural. The Frankenstein stuff, the fact that it's grown in a lab, it feels really deeply unsettling because in fact it's probably a successful marketing ploy that's convinced us that our meat-based products are coming from happy cows on nice big open farms in the UK. Whereas to be honest, what is being offered here is not new science, it's better science. And what's currently happening is a lot of bad science. I think sort of 3 antibiotics taken in the world out of every 4 are taken by cattle. And the amount of antibiotics going into our meat that we then eat is causing extreme concerns about antibiotic resistant pandemics, which would be, orders of magnitude worse than the one that we've just seen in the last couple of years if they resist our medication of choice. And in terms of the science, the amount of sort of medication, the amount of, I guess, sort of genetic development that's occurred in the last 100 years to get meat production as cheap as it is, as industrial as it is, has been extraordinary. And I think as someone who eats meat, I have perhaps shied away from some of the more gruesome depictions of how our meat is grown and transported to our supermarket shelves. But certainly, if you look into it, the amount of science that's going in is extensive and abominable and terrifying to someone who eats that stuff. And what's being offered is actually probably a much cleaner and safer alternative. It can be engineered to be even better for us, fewer additives, fewer preservatives, fewer fertilizers going into the soil. And as I say, a dramatically smaller physical and environmental footprint as well. And that sort of cost saving, which can be achieved in time through the learning curve, alongside the planet saving that it entails, is probably going to be too much to turn our noses up to. And I think probably where the way I think about it in terms of, you're not going to go to the best steak restaurants and find maybe the cultivated one, or actually, I don't even know that, but probably where it comes in is in your BLT first, right? Where that salty stick could be anything, or where the quality is already very low, or the flavor profile or texture profile isn't incredible, and that's where it's easiest to be disrupted. And that's where the cost savings will be most attractive, is at the lowest end of the food in the supermarket. That's my suspicion. I don't know if that's true, but I'm not expecting it to be these perfect chicken breasts that are being sold every day. At least not
Yeah,
at
it
the
is
start.
it does, as you say, new world investing. It does summon the idea from Brave New World. Though when you talk about lab grown stuff, it reminds me more of the classic Soylent Green example, which is maybe a little more. Well, are you familiar with Soylent Green, Kit?
I'm actually not.
Wow! Oh, wow! Well, you're in for quite a surprise. There was a movie made of it, I think, back in the '70s. But Soylent Green, it's one of those interesting sort of works of art where it then sort of ends up becoming reality. So in the book Soylent Green, it's set in the future, and there's big shortages of all manner of different foods because there's overpopulation, things like that. And they and the main character discovers, he's like, I think he's a detective, discovers that this stuff that everyone is being given to eat, called Soylent Green, is actually made of dead people. They're actually, when people die, they're actually turning it into food. And this is very horrific, and it's almost like a horror sci-fi book, because there's this big sort of revelation that, oh man, the entire population is eating. Where they're unwitting cannibals. Despite this, however, an entrepreneur still saw a business opportunity in creating the food substitute, which we call Soylent. It's a brand name, Soylent, containing soy, of course, instead of people. But when you talk about lab-grown meat, it does bring to mind this more dystopian idea of the future, though. Of course, maybe there's something of a marketing issue, you could argue, Kit, that we just don't know the grim details that go on behind the meat process that we currently have. Just going through the chat. Welcome to John and Barry and Natalia, who have joined us this evening, and to Seamus, who asks, "Where's the love in the lab?" Which, I guess it's part of the marketing problem that the lab grown meat industry has yet to conquer. I mean, Kit, if I'm coming at this as a skeptic, uh, do you not feel that this could be one of these things that one finds in cosmopolitan centers like Whole Foods, like asparagus water and activated almonds, that people from who live around that area, who generally are very well off and like posting a lot of things on Instagram, they'll have it, but it won't really catch on in the broader world?
Uh, yeah, I mean, you say coming at this from a skeptic's perspective. I am too. I think, a lot of it is very new and very strange to me. And I suppose the way that I think about it is maybe the way in which solar and wind power were talked about 20 odd years ago, or how, the alternative meats that you consider commonplace at your dinner table in your childhood, Boaz, were maybe 10 years ago. And, corn was one of the first ones, but the Impossible Foods and Beyond Meat burgers that have come through now, along with so many alternatives that are now in the supermarkets, and much more, I guess, well, much closer to cost parity, or even better than cost parity with their meat alternatives. It's just a very steady sort of explosion. Even if something has 0.001% of the market and doubles every year for 10 years, it's still not at 1%. But then once it reaches that, 1, 2, 4, 8% takeoff period in the markets, then the sort of the market dynamics of people having tried it and vouching for it, those start to pay off. That's something we're seeing now with electric vehicles as well, is the exponential growth of these things really takes off at a certain point. And it's incredibly new. A lot of it is fairly unsettling, but with my investment hat on, you see a cost curve for a product that's going to save energy, time, water, and carbon, and it's going to be cheaper than the alternative. You have to recognize that is how disruption happens. That's how it happened in, the phone industry, the computer industry. I mean, the disk drive industry. I don't know if anyone's read The Innovator's Dilemma, but it focuses on the disk drive industry. And these cost breakthroughs, they actually drive the creation of new markets as much as anything. It's like how there were cars coming in to replace horses before there was a road network. And so I'm just being humble, I guess, about what's possible and what I might be eating in 10 years, even though I probably traditionally would be quite sure of myself when it comes to the food that I eat, and wouldn't want to try. So I'm giving it a chance.
I did see an article. I think it was during the first lockdown, where you saw some really barmy articles, or at least they felt very barmy to me, where somebody was making the argument that in the future, due to the lab-grown meat, there's going to be this moral dilemma for some people, that it is possible to create human meat burgers that have been grown in labs now, and whether or not this actually poses an ethical problem. And I certainly hope that we don't encounter anything like that in the next 10 years. But Kit, looking at the world as it is now, we're actually going to see an extraordinary amount of food price inflation, I think, in the near future, given what's going on, especially with Ukraine and Russia, with the grains. But even before this conflict, things were already looking pretty bad when it came to food prices and soft commodities in general. Do you think that this kind of innovation might be something that's actually required to be built out if we do face some serious food shortages in the next 10 years?
Yeah, I certainly do. And I think, Boaz, we spoke about this last week, right, with wheat and corn being two of the biggest exports from Ukraine. I think wheat prices are up 50% since when we were talking about it last week. So you were spot on. And we were right to talk about it. I think one of the things that is sort of happening is that people just take for granted that the food system is currently operating very well. And I think that's something that definitely isn't true. There's a few things like the depletion of the oceans from fish, the fact that there are going to be more items of plastic in the ocean than fish by 2050 on current projections. Things like human health, like how healthy is our food really? I mentioned how what's coming is better science rather than new science. There's already a lot of science, medication, fertilizers that goes into the soils and the meat that we eat, and that's not doing us a huge amount of good. And I think it's possible to do a lot better. And when you talk about food price inflation, the key challenge, right, is that the population is going to grow to 10 billion people by 2050. We are going to have to massively reduce our carbon footprint along the way while economies are bringing people out of poverty all over the world, giving them more electricity. I mean, we use an, an incredible amount more electricity in our developed Western nations than they do in the emerging economies. And we want them to be able to reach parity with us in terms of, the amount of energy that they use on an annual basis per person. But we want to do it more sustainably. And food currently is responsible, I think, for 26% of global emissions. That's according to our world in data, but the estimates range higher and lower than that. And we are going to have to find a way to do this much more sustainably than we currently do. And cultivated meat, as we've spoken about, is one example, but there are so many. I mean, precision agriculture just involves the use of data and more advanced machinery to be much more precise in the way that you do things. So instead of tilling the soil, which releases carbon and lowers the sort of quality of the soil over time, I think there's the amount of carbon in soil has halved since the Industrial Revolution. So that's a big problem because it sequesters a huge amount of carbon. And we talk about net zero, that means it's got to be stored in the trees and the soil rather than getting to zero carbon. That's an important point to remember. And yeah, just all of the different ways to get the food industry, transportation, packaging, production, land use change, deforestation, all of those things, we're going to have to find better ways. And cultivated meat, precision agriculture, doing that better, and vertical farming is the final one that I've mentioned. But there's so many more. One final stat for you, if I may, Boaz, on this topic, is that it takes something like 15,000 liters of water and 1,000 kilos of carbon to produce a single kilogram of beef. And the numbers sort of rattle around, but there are 90 to 99% reductions available for different kinds of fruits, vegetables, and nuts, which is your territory. And there's also huge savings available when it comes to more modern methods of cultivating meat. And so we are going to have to find the best ones. As always, there's no silver bullet. It's not cultivated meat replacing industrially farmed meat, but it's everything chipping away at that 26% figure to try and get the food industry's contribution to climate change dramatically down as soon as we possibly can.
It is an interesting topic, and certainly not one that I encounter very often when it comes to people looking at things like climate change and lowering carbon emissions, or not that much. You do get it with cattle, with a lot of folks complaining about methane emissions and things like that. But it's not something you ever see front and center when people talk about the climate debate. I think it's generally more about vehicular transport of one side or another. And it is something I imagine we'll see a lot more of. I do wonder, Kit, whether or not it's with a lot of the climate change and net zero stuff, whether or not it's going to be more a process of push rather than pull, in that I think people might be forced into doing this because of, for example, food shortages in the future, rather than driven by our government has a big commitment to reducing our carbon footprint, things like that, which I think neatly ties into a topic I'd like to discuss with you, which is with the Germany, Ukraine, Russia situation. There are a couple of headlines I think we could take a look at here, which is just looking at how Germany has gone harder into the renewable sector, due to their reliance on Russia for energy. And there was an article in the Guardian here saying this is how the West defeats Putin. It's by adopting renewables, which I find a very interesting topic. Personally, I'm not massively convinced, but of course, you can't ignore the fact that governments are taking very large action on this, and this goes into your wheelhouse, Kit. So I would wonder, for example, if lab-grown meat is going to be a very big thing in the future. I think that will depend more on whether or not there are massive food shortages rather than whether or not there are more people who are simply going to like it and will virtuously do it instead because they're very conscious about the environment. Similarly, I think maybe renewables in Europe may again be a factor of the West trying to decouple itself from reliance on Russian energy rather than because they want to virtue signal while driving around in their electric vehicles. Would you agree with me on that? And could you give us your thoughts on the on this statement by Germany that they're going to go even harder in the renewable sector?
Yeah, I think I'd absolutely agree with a lot of what you said there, Boaz. And I think probably the main point is how much better things could have been if we didn't wait until the crisis to transition, because renewables can't actually dig us out of that, our current hole this month. Gas prices are soaring. They went up 40% the day Russia invaded Ukraine, and they were already having an abominable 6 months. It's a terrible situation. And I think someone said that gas prices in Europe are trading at the equivalent of $360 oil. And just imagine what that would do to the global economy. And so, we touched on this last Friday, but everyone was initially worried when Russia invaded that they would be weaponizing their fossil fuel exports against us because we're so reliant on their gas. But the truth is probably that they need our cash more than we need their gas. I think fossil fuels make up 60% of Russia's export revenue every year, whereas gas, we get 40% of our gas from Russia, and that makes up about 20% of our energy needs in a given year. So they are incredibly reliant. Our purchases of their fossil fuels have funded this war. And in fact, the greatest sanction that we can levy upon Russia is to reduce our energy usage. And the Bill McGibbon article is absolutely brilliant. It argues the case that the long-term solution to get away from crises like these is to transition more aggressively towards renewables. Heat pumps is a classic example. Heating of homes is probably the great remaining use of gas in Europe and the UK, and heat pumps do it electrically. They can be powered by renewables. They're much more efficient than gas boilers. And at the moment, the problem is that they're expensive. They're more expensive than boilers in the short term. The payoff takes a long time to come through, somewhere between 10 and 20 years. So he argues for sort of America ramping up heat pumps as they ramped up, the production of tanks back in World War II as a sort of military response to Russia. We can build heat pumps rather than weapons and tackle Russia that way. And it's a very nice idea. But the problem is, as you say, that once the crisis hits, it's too late. So in the current situation, we're already seeing Germany start to turn the cruise ship when it comes to their nuclear shutoffs. I mean, everyone's been saying for years that it was a terrible idea, you and me both, Boaz. And we're starting to see politicians in that country say maybe we should keep the $20 per megawatt hour nuclear plants on instead of paying $330 for gas. So that's one thing. Getting liquid natural gas from other places in the world will be another. And efficiency is going to be the third major short-term gain. I think I saw that just turning thermostats in Europe down by 1 degree could save 1/15 of the gas that we import from Russia every year, which is an incredible stat on how powerful efficiency can be. But the argument about meat, Boaz, I think just speaks to the idea that we need to push these things ahead of the crisis. The crises are coming. Climate change is causing incredible devastation across the world. As the world gets drier in hot places and colder in wet ones, the availability of crops is going to suffer. We're already seeing key rivers in Brazil drying up that are used for the transportation of corn. We're seeing crop failures due to extreme temperatures. The food crisis is arriving now. It's caused by climate change. And the sooner that technology can help us to find alternatives in the form of better agriculture, vertical farms, cultivated meat, lower water usage, whatever that is, we need to aggressively chase those now, because if we think an energy crisis is bad, a food crisis is 10 times worse. I mean, what that does to societies across the globe is pretty unimaginable. And, the energy crisis is going to push us closer to that horrible eventuality. And, all that can be said is we need to push as quickly as possible to get ahead of the crisis rather than waiting for the energy crisis as we have done in this situation.
When you say we need to do it, I mean, what do you really have in mind?
Uh, that is a very good question. I think you mentioned that governments are pushing it, but I think my great hope is that the technological disruptions are happening so much faster than people realize. Already, solar and wind are cheaper than their coal and gas-based alternatives. In a lot of Western developed nations or in the hottest parts of the world, it's cheaper to tear down your coal plant that you've already built and build solar in its place. That's a more economical option. It's not just a comparison of two greenfield sites, coal or solar. You can tear one down and you're still going to make better money over the long run. So that disruption has happened now. And the ones that are coming, I mentioned the one in food is another example, in transportation too. Uh, these disruptions in transportation is to do with how autonomy can massively bring down the costs of transport. Um, these disruptions are going to happen, I think, faster than a lot of people think. They already have done in energy. Um, but the rest of it is around good policy. And that's where, what does it matter what I say? I think I've been heartened by a lot of the talk in the last few years. Some of the policies are currently backfiring. And I think it's safe to say that I'm maybe more optimistic about the technologies today than I was 2 years ago. But maybe I'm also more optimistic about their objectives, about their intentions in the political class, but maybe I'm less optimistic about the ability to, for the ability of any politician or any person to harness the complexity of an energy of a global sustainability transition that we need. And we're just going to have to be very responsive and consider ourselves very lucky that we have these cheaper, better technologies coming down the road, because ultimately they may be the ones who save us from what Nick Hubble would no doubt no doubt call the doom brought upon us by the politicians.
Indeed, indeed. On that note, Kit, you say you're more optimistic about the technology, indeed, but also about political will. But of course, there is a very there's a very large elephant in the room here, which is the consumer. There's a very good quote from a private equity chap working in oil and gas. I believe it was in Texas a while back, saying how it seems like everyone in the oil industry and indeed in politics had just made the decision that we're not going to be exploring for any more oil over the next few years, but no one bothered to tell the consumer. And John here in the chat says, when certain classes of people are forced or pushed into what I assume is sort of the green sustainable mindset, I believe the pushback will be huge and no amount of net zero target will cut the mustard for them. Very interesting comment, John. And I'm pretty sympathetic to that view. I don't think people are so enormously receptive to the saving the planet agenda. Obviously, you do see the Extinction Rebellion guys gluing themselves to the tube and streets and things like that. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's because I'm a jaded cynic. But I don't get the impression there is an enormous amount of political support from the consumer for these kind of policies, Kit. Would you disagree with me on that?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, there's a lot of people in the UK government at the moment, especially in the Conservative Party and some others, who seem to believe that net zero is one of these, you know, uh, European membership style things imposed upon us against our will, and they're going to try and challenge it. But I think the reality is that getting to net zero by 2050 was in every major manifesto in the most recent election, and so you can consider it to have had something like 95% of the UK vote. And then alongside that, every poll that's conducted is, along the lines of 78% in favor of getting to net zero. And you mentioned the Extinction Rebels; they're an extreme case, but think about the people in Eastern Australia right now. They had a month of rain in an hour. It's been raining for 10 days, and there are 6 more forecast. It's the middle of their summer. I mean, Australia is an extreme place, but in the last year we saw flooding in Germany. We've seen record heat waves that hit 50 degrees 3 days in a row in British Columbia in Canada, which I tend to think of for its ski resorts. So that's pretty confusing. And all over the world, extreme weather is now starting to hit us at an ever greater rate. I think the increase is something like 300% since the 1970s in terms of natural disasters affecting our world. And we're getting so much better at dealing with them. So fewer people are dying, but there are 20 million people who are being displaced by climate disasters now every year. And that element of things, I think, really is hitting people. And the pandemic, for whatever reason, Boaz, and I don't really have an answer to this, but it seemed to awaken a consumer desire to accelerate the transition. Suddenly, whether it was investors, politicians, consumers, business groups, everyone was talking about it, and it has been given a real boost. It has really accelerated in terms of momentum since the pandemic. And I don't know what links those two things. Maybe it's realizing in the face of one crisis that there's another bigger one coming down the line. But certainly, when it comes to forcing things on people, I agree with the point that was made by the reader, and I agree with your point, Bo, is that if you try and force it on people in a haphazard manner, it won't go well. And saying that, as with the drug war, you need to tackle demand rather than supply. If you tackle supply, they'll just get it from somewhere else or at a higher price. So tackling demand is the key issue. And again, I go back to the point that my optimism is that the technologies are coming through at an incredible rate, and that we are going to be able to offer consumers a better product at a cheaper price point, and that's what's going to turn the tide. It's happened with electricity in the form of solar and wind. It's happening now with electric vehicles, whose market share has doubled 2 years in a row, now to 8.1% globally. They're going to sell 6 million electric vehicles in China next year. And the extraordinary adoption of cheaper, better technologies happens very quickly once it arrives. And that disruption, that climate tech disruption, is what I see is going to really turn the tide.
I certainly would agree that a market-based solution, a technological innovation that ultimately does the job better, would be significantly better than politicians forcing stuff on us for our benefit. Though one, you talk about solar and wind quite broadly, Kit, and obviously solar and wind is different
Yeah.
all across the world. So over we've got a chap, Robbie, I believe, is in the UK. I'm assuming it is. Oh well, no. In fact, he does say in his comment, he's got he's got a load of batteries for backup from an 8 kilowatt inverter in case of power cuts. Did hook them up to solar panels, but in the UK, it's useless. Now I just charge up every 3 months from the mains. I mean, looking at things like solar in the UK, is this really going to be something that we can rely on very heavily in the future?
I'd say there's two main points there. Firstly, which is we get some solar, but we get much more wind. We're the windiest country in the UK, and there's a definite element of horses for courses, and that's almost the beauty. And we're seeing that at the moment, where everyone is dependent on the same commodity from one country, Russia. There's a whole host of countries in Eastern Europe who get more than 50% of their gas from Russia, and that makes you pretty vulnerable. But all of them have some kind of asset, whether it's hydro, whether it's solar, or whether it's wind. So here in the UK, we get a lot of wind on and offshore. We have an incredible coastline, and Scotland has just leased out an immense amount of offshore wind to be built in the next 5 years. So yeah, we're windier than we are sunny. That works. We can build more wind. But at the same time, long-term, long-distance electricity interconnectors are suddenly becoming economically viable. So we now have an agreement to build an electricity interconnector with Morocco, which gets 300 days of sun a year. It can produce solar at prices a quarter of what we can do in the UK, much more reliably. And then that counts as a source of diversification as well, because that's going to come in at different times and with more regularity, more similar to a baseload source because of its climate than solar or wind could here in the UK. So if you couple diversification onshore with our own solar and wind, we've got some nuclear as well. If you couple that with interconnectors to places with different climate or microclimate characteristics to our own, that helps to build the sort of resilience that we're going to need. And then alongside, better grid management, which we're already learning about, and batteries, as this person has brilliantly sorted out for themselves, there is a way to do it much better.
You said we're the windiest country in the UK. Do you mean we're the windiest country in Europe? Sorry.
Yeah, we're the windiest country in Europe, mainly thanks to you boys up north, Boaz.
Yeah, we're doing our thing. Though while we have been building an awful lot of offshore wind up in Scotland, Kit, where there's a fair bit of activity going into the oil fields right now, and I imagine that they'll be doing that for quite a while. I mean, we've managed to see oil now, Brent at least, at $116, which is really quite extraordinary considering how fast it's gotten there with the whole Russia and Ukraine crisis. What's your thoughts on what fossil fuels are going to do in the intervening period while the energy transition that you see in the future happens?
Yeah, it's a very difficult picture, right? The Ukraine crisis has highlighted something that people were already talking about, which was inflation, both driving and responding to higher oil prices, shortages of supply, and a surge in demand coming off the back of a pandemic. There are various analysts talking about different things with this. Some say that OPEC have 4 to 6 million barrels per day of excess supply, and they could flood the market and reduce prices if they want to. Some say that in Europe, our response to this is going to be to dramatically increase our energy efficiency, go to LNG, and switch nuclear back on. And there are analysts who are saying we're going to be heavily undersupplied of fossil fuels relative to our total energy demand for years to come, and it's going to be very, very dangerous indeed. And I think you have to be seriously concerned about what high prices can do. And I think people on my side of the debate, the people wearing the green jumpers, Boaz, we need to realize that an energy transition won't happen if we enforce $200 oil on everyone, or $300 oil, or $360 oil equivalent gas prices, as we're seeing in Europe right now. And if you'll excuse me, and that it's reasonable to take short-term measures to mitigate extreme financial and economic pain resulting from high fossil fuel prices in the short term, because if, as you say, Boaz, we need people to buy into this, and enforcing inflation and high gas prices at the pump, and that's going to feed into every single product and service that we pay for. That's not going to do anyone any favors. And also, we need to think about the climate crisis is one of the worst things that's happening in the world over the next 30 to 50 years, and we have to do everything we can about it. But there are other concerns in the world. There's a hierarchy of needs. There's food, there's energy, there's everything else that we need in society today. And inflicting pain in other areas to save it in others, you do have to do that math and balance it. And I think it's important for people not to be absolute in rejecting all fossil fuels. But having said that, the North Sea exploration is not going to help us within the next few years. The 6 oil fields that they're talking about leasing for in the North Sea, and the things I've mentioned, LNG, nuclear, and efficiency, can be quicker and they can be better, I think.
I guess it all depends on the energy mix that we'll see going forward, and indeed on the export opportunities. Because if we do see an incredibly high oil prices continue and even get worse, I mean, it's not like the oil in the North Sea has to stay even in Europe. It can be transported all over the place. So it will be very interesting to see what happens there. I mean, Kit, do you think? The argument that's often been given by folks on your side is generally that high oil prices are really good for green, because it makes all of the renewable stuff much more feasible. If you're paying $150 a barrel, as we did a little over 10 years ago, then it makes all of these other technologies, and you can go way further out than wind and solar. You can go into geothermal and things like that. It makes all of these other ideas much more feasible. Do you not think that high oil prices, necessity being the mother of invention, could actually accelerate what you see in the new world and bring it forward much quicker?
Yeah, I mean, our very own Tracy, who I am actually interviewing next week for something called the Climate Tech Fortune Summit, and he gives a brilliant talk in that. So I encourage people to sign up if they can. But he pointed out this incredible thing where maybe up until 2018, if oil prices rose, that would reflect very well on renewable stocks, because oil majors, they have the biggest budgets to spend on things like renewables. And so as the oil price went up, they would have more to spend on the transition. And that was the way it was basically seen. But the inflection point around 2018-19 came when the disruption happened, when solar and wind became more economically viable than their fossil fuel predecessors. And suddenly that was inversed. And so demand destruction came into play, as you say, Boaz. So now when we see $115 oil, we also think electric vehicle takeoff. And we think that every company will be thinking, man, gas prices are at $360 oil equivalent. They're spiking in Europe. If only we had some wind, solar, or nuclear. people will be having those conversations. They'll be looking for alternatives. They'll be looking for ways to save electricity. And for the first time in 100 years, fossil fuels have a competitor. And if their prices go up, as with any market now, they will see people switching to the alternative. So that is definitely something that we're going to see. But at the same time, although, the green jumpers like me have been hoping for it, it's worth remembering that fossil fuels are something that have been burned in the West to fuel our economies for 150 years and given us the incredible life that we have. The effects of climate change are now going to be imposed upon mainly people in developing nations where the climates are worse and their resilience is worse because their economies aren't as developed as ours. So they don't have as much money to fight it, and they're going to be worse impacted by it. If you're in Africa and the temperatures are searing, if you're in the wettest places on earth, if you're in India, these places are least capable of handling it. And they are also now probably least capable of dealing quickly with rises in the oil price, which we are now also causing by trying to get away from them and fighting our wars in the developed world. So once again, we are managing to, I don't know, the movement of climate justice I find quite compelling at the moment. It's hard to see solutions because even at COP26 in Glasgow, they couldn't reach the 100 billion figure where the developed nations agreed to try and get 100 billion going to developing nations every year to help them mitigate the worst effects of climate change. That's something that we do need to see a lot more of. We need to be very aware that when we celebrate the demand destruction from higher oil and gas prices, that we're aware that there's another side to that coin and that we have to try and handle that as well.
Yeah, if you think energy inflation is bad here, just
Yeah.
go over to Malawi and see how bad it is there. Same with food price inflation as well. A lot of folks who are in a lot of the politicos here in the developed world, where we're very privileged with our access to energy and to food. Sometimes their policy decisions, which which reflect to our own consumption, can have massive knock-on effects in the developing world. And it's one of the big things I fear with a lot of the policies that are proposed to deal with our either reducing our energy consumption or our carbon footprint. I worry whether or not this will actually be really bad for the developing countries who they need lots of energy and they need lots of food as well because they're the growing ones. We're just taking a quick look through the chat. Rebecca says, "Great chat so far." Thank you very much, Rebecca. And we have a question from Natalia. It says, "When potentially will we be able to finally say, now the climate crisis is over?" I think that's a great question. The answer is, of course, on a postcard, I think. But when indeed? Kit, could you give us an idea? I'm very jaded and I'll cheat, so I'll say never because it's a very convenient excuse for politicians to tax and spend and get us to do all manner of things. But I'm sure, Kit, you have a much more optimistic view of the future.
Yeah, I suppose I do think that we will make a very large contribution to balancing. And I think that's, you mentioned at the start this thing called New World investing. We're in a place now where we extract things, we burn them, we use them once, plastic packaging, fossil fuels, whatever it is. And we need to move at some point in the next million years, hopefully the next 30, to a global operating system, a global economy where things can run as if they can run forever. Because at the moment, the way that we're doing things has a lot of endpoints that are very, very damaging, either through climate crisis, food crisis, energy crisis, whatever that may be. They are unsustainable in their very nature. And we need to get to a place where the whole global economy is operating on a sustainable nature. And if you think about it, either we do that or we fail as a species, because that is the very essence of what we're doing. So I'm certain that we will get there because we absolutely have to. The question then is when, and I would say that we are going to do a lot of work in the next 20 to 40 years, and I'm being quite vague about that, but that it's quite possible it will take a lot longer than that, because I think when you think about what a carbon atom does in the atmosphere, it takes decades to have its full effect. So even if we were to go to zero emissions today, not net zero, but zero, still the carbon emissions from the last 50 years would continue to cause the global warming that we're seeing, that is causing increasing natural disasters, that is causing energy and food crises today. So yes, I'm optimistic that in the second half of this century, the climate crisis won't be over, but it will no longer be the greatest concern of humanity. And I'm also optimistic that when we do get to that incredible new sustainable world, Boaz, that it will be a better one, that things will be cheaper, things will be healthier, things will be more equitably distributed. That's the point about what I was talking about with food earlier, is it can solve a lot of part of the food crisis. So we have 2 billion people in the world today who are overweight or obese, but 700 million who are malnourished. And in the global system, we waste a third of all the food we produce. And imagine how much carbon and water and time and energy and human work has gone into producing all that food. We waste a third of it. And I just think there's a much better way to do all these things. Mining would be another example where the extractive destruction of extracting all the materials, metals that we need for t-shirts, food products, packaging, cars, laptops, pencils, whatever you want to talk about. There are better ways of doing that too, and that's another issue with resources in the future of energy bars, where an antagonist power maybe has a bit too much control over the things that we need. So that's definitely another huge challenge that's going to need to be overcome.
Yeah, control of resources is one of the classic motives for somebody to go to war. Natalia, I hope that's answered your question. When will we be able to finally say now the climate crisis is over? In the next million years, but hopefully in the next 20 to 40. That's from Kit. I'll say never, but that's just me. Interestingly, we do have quite a few comments on your jumper, Kit. It is a very green jumper. We see a few comments referencing it. Some saying, how far has it traveled? Has it been renewably made? Is it created using cabbage from Jason? Funnily enough, Kit, there's a fashion brand called Volleback, which makes really crazy like next gen clothing, and you sometimes see people wearing them in movies and stuff. If you saw what was it, Hidden Gems, with Adam Sandler playing the pawnbroker in New York. There's a well, it was very popular. I think in the latter side of 2020. Anyway, in it, The Weeknd, the pop star's in it, and he's wearing this bright, it like glows in the dark orange jacket, and you can actually buy one of these things. But the same brand does make a T-shirt that is made out of algae, because they want to be really, really renewable and really, they want to be on the side of the green jumpers. And apparently, you can wash this thing. It's completely fine in the wash. However, if you leave it for a long enough time on a compost heap in a damp environment, it will actually completely decompose. So maybe we'll be wearing these in the next 20 to 40 years. Seamus is reminiscing the lack of John this evening. John is often wearing the scarf, so we have no one wearing a scarf this evening. But I must say, Kit, showing up with the green jumper for a green themed Southbank Live is very apt indeed. On a more serious note, Kit, and just speaking more broadly, I did get a question, a comment actually from Paul, which is regarding those heat pumps you were referring to. So there was that Guardian article we referenced earlier, where this chap was calling for the US to go on full military industrial mode and just start churning out heat pumps in order to save the world. Paul comments, heat pumps only heat to about 17 degrees. They're pretty much useless for the average home. Well, have you any experience with actually using these heat pumps? Because it's not something I have any knowledge on, I'm afraid.
Yeah, it's a completely valid point. They are complicated little beasts. James Allen, my colleague, is about to install one in his home, so it certainly is possible. And the idea is that over the course of its lifetime, you save a lot on your heating. Your home becomes much more energy efficient as a result. But yeah, I've also heard stories of cases where they're just not suitable for certain homes. If you don't have, a little shed out in the back that you can put it in, an air source heat pump to be precise, then it doesn't really work for certain houses, or in certain places you're going to have to rip up the existing plumbing to make it work with the heat pump. They're not, and none of these things that I've spoken about this evening, they're not a silver bullet, they're not a perfect solution. But when you churn out 1.8 million heat pumps for homes in Europe, you're going to make a dent in the gas bill of Europe. And that is a worthy cause. They're certainly not for everyone, and they're certainly not cheap today. We're hoping that they're going to come down in price along with other technological developments. And they're certainly worth looking into for anyone these calls, because they can, if appropriate, save you money on your electricity bills for decades to come. But no, they're no silver bullet, and they're not perfect for every home. It's important to recognise that.
It will be, yeah. It's there was that big trend for smart meters a couple of years ago, and everyone was saying smart meter is going to change the game. There was a big investment thing about it at the time as well. I believe I could be completely wrong, so don't quote me on it, but I believe Prudential, one of the world's largest insurers, because they've got such an enormous fund of money, they end up investing in everything. It's almost like the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund. But they had a big private equity arm, and I remember they were pretty crazy on smart meters, something very sort of UK focused green technology, I suppose you could call it. A question from Michael, which I think is very good. As the world's biggest manufacturer, how committed is China to renewable energy? Kit, I'll let you take it away with that one, because it's a big question, and there are so many different ways you can answer it.
Yes, they are incredibly committed, is the answer, but in lots of different ways, as you say. I think in December 2020, they installed 112,000 electric vehicle chargers. That's more than America had installed in its entire history. So there's always a rule with China that everything they do is usually the top of that list because they are the biggest. So it's important to reduce things to a per capita thing, but they're responsible for something like 50% of global investment in renewables every year. Their wind farms by size are bigger than the entire wind capacities of most countries. They are building unbelievable amounts of renewables, electric vehicle chargers. They're the biggest market in the world for electric vehicles. As I said, they sold 3.3 million last year, and they're going to sell something like 6 million next year. But they're also determinately going after it in other ways. For example, they dominate the supply chain of everything to do with the energy transition. They are responsible for over 75% of lithium refining. They're responsible for 80% of the lithium-ion battery value chain. They process 90% of rare earth metals, which are a key component to almost all energy transition technologies. And they manufacture most of the solar panels. They're hugely involved in the wind power supply chain. And that's something to be really concerned about. We spoke earlier about the food crisis emanating from Ukraine, the energy crisis in Europe. These are things that happen when you allow the supply and production of critical materials to your economy to happen almost entirely in a state that hates you. And I think one of the big themes that we're going to see for this decade, and we've already started to see it, is the onshoring and securing of supply chains for these things, because China has moved early and at scale to dominate them. And now we're just seeing the first solar manufacturing plant start up again in Europe this year, and they're starting to try and build our local supply chain. In America, they're looking for sources of lithium supply. Cobalt is almost uniformly mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo with very, very uncertain workplace safety and worker safety criteria. And there are very few places elsewhere in the world that are trying to dig it up. So China is moving aggressively in both a good and a threatening way.
It's interesting. I mean, from what you're saying, effectively, we face a similar issue to what Germany's realized, or a lot of Western Europe has realized with their reliance on Russia, where if we are going into this new world you describe, where everything is really uber renewable, the developed world will be beholden to China for its energy in a lot of ways, right?
Yeah, I think the building of the transition is going to be the big challenge there. But the beauty of these things, as I say, their technology is not commodities. So once you've built a solar farm, it will generate solar power for free for 30 years, maybe more. And that's true of wind farms as well. The big thing is also going to be battery recycling, is learning how to take these end-of-life batteries and get the metals back out of them and build them back into new ones. And that will then massively reduce the need for the building of new things. And I talked about the resource intensity of all this. Recycling is going to play a huge part, from paper and plastic packaging to the batteries we have in our cars and phones, to the wind turbines that we currently put in the bin, which is a bit of a shame.
Yeah, all that balsa wood. It's
All that also would.
there's a
They
lot
get
of
pretty nice
model
bike
enthusiasts,
shelters, so
a lot of model enthusiasts very irritated at the wind farm industry.
rightly
But
seething.
But yeah, and you have to see them as well, which is, of course, irritates an awful lot of people in the country. It's yet another hurdle that the green jumper crowd must
Yeah.
vault over.
Of
But
course,
going
we
back to
love it when we see them, Boaz. We think amazing. It fills us with joy. So we just can't empathise with the people who hate them. But no, you're right. Not in my backyard is something that needs to be overcome.
I remember there was I think it was in Private Eye in their Christmas edition many years ago, which was, they have all these joke adverts for gifts you can give to your relatives, and one of them was for a bonsai wind farm, which you could leave on your sill, and if you left it running there for a year, it could charge your toothbrush for 3 minutes. Which, of course, it's a lot smaller, wouldn't it? But it does, it still sticks with me, that idea. Going back to Michael's question, however, as the world's biggest manufacturer, how committed is China to renewable energy? I think there's so many caveats with the answer. So China, obviously, has invested an enormous amount in, as you say, the supply chain for creating renewable technologies, batteries. So much of sub-Saharan Africa, with the mines and that, as you refer to in the Congo, are they're being financed, they're being run, they're often being, in some places, armed as well by the PLA, which is a very interesting scenario that you find. However, when it comes to how committed they are to renewable energy, there is this enormous elephant in the room with China's own carbon emissions. So I can only use the figures from pre-pandemic. So I've not seen a thorough analysis of it since then. But pre-pandemic, China emitted more carbon purely from its coal emissions, none of the other emissions, purely from coal, more emissions than South America, Africa, and Europe combined. And that was all of Europe, Africa, and South America's emissions combined, not just their coal ones.
Yeah.
Which I think is just a really remarkable topic. And when you see the Greta Thunbergs of the world criticize every democratic state there is for their lack of action on this, and then stay completely mute when it comes to the Chinese Communist Party and China as a country, which is the world's largest carbon emitter of them all, it does make one question the motives and the moral virtue of those who are promoting it. I mean, Kit, do you think China is going to actually be able to wean itself off fossil fuels? Because the way they're going with coal power plants, and they'll market it as, oh well, don't worry, these are clean coal power plants. It just doesn't. They don't. It doesn't sell it to me.
Yeah, I think there's two main points here. The first one is to recognize the importance of per capita statistics. As I said, China is top of the list for almost every category you look at. It is definitely top of the list for carbon emissions and sort of emits more in a year than most of the rest of the world has in history. There's some incredible stats going around, and they are starting to build a few coal plants again this year. But the story of the last 7 or 8 years in China has definitely been recognizing that renewables are more economically advantageous, massively winding down its coal expansion program. So they were on schedule to build hundreds of coal plants. Now it's tens, and you have to recognize that while they're building a lot less than they were going to. China's, before the pandemic at least, was 47th globally in terms of per capita energy emissions. And it's important to recognize what coal has achieved for that country. And China has brought more people out of poverty in the last 30 years than any other country, any time in history. The Communist Party is doing a lot of horrible, awful, evil things that you've done a brilliant job of documenting, Boaz, and you speak very well on that topic. We have to remember that recovering from the ills of the even more communist party before them, they did put a lot of people out of poverty, and that was a coal-driven surge. And that's where weighing up real human necessities and the climate crisis, you do have to play that game a little bit. But on the China renewables thing, someone called James Heal, who's setting up a sustainable fund, a very impressive chap who I spoke to a number of months ago, he shared with me a very interesting idea. Which was that China was the big story no one was talking about here when it came to renewables and inflation, because renewables are offering zero margin cost electricity, and China sees that once you've built out your infrastructure, you can have free power, basically, almost free power. There are some repair costs, but at the margin, it is free power. And the story of the last decade since the financial crisis, as you know, Boaz, was China coming into the global economy and driving deflation. And a lot of people are seeing that changing as globalization slightly splinters. We're seeing it with Russia, we're seeing it with China, and people think rightly that inflation is something to be very concerned about, and that China bringing hundreds of millions of people, workers, products onto the market cannot drive that deflation train anymore. But what James said, which I thought was really interesting, was that they were attacking renewables so aggressively because they see that it is an opportunity to continue undercutting the rest of the global economy. Because if you can power your t-shirt production plant, your laptop manufacturing plant, your semiconductor plants with power that has been built by the government with money that they've printed and is now being given to you for free, you can undercut the whole global economy. And that is an incredibly powerful advantage. And he thinks that that's exactly what they're doing. And it is right to notice that they are building unbelievable amounts of renewables. They're investing more than any other country. They're investing more than the rest of the world combined every single year, and they are going for it. And it's entirely possible that he's right, and that they have seen that this is the most powerful opportunity to deflate your energy costs, contrary to what's happening to our fossil fuels and our gas, and thereby to compete even more effectively with the economies that it is trying to outdo and surpass.
It's a very apt response, I would say. Now, yeah, we do get a good question here, which we have been kind of skirting around an awful lot uh, through this entire episode, for that matter, coming from VJ, who says, "What companies should we be investing in based on this expected uplift when it comes to renewables and the rise of renewables?" Now, Kit, you've actually been interviewing awfully large group of experts on this topic exactly. And you put it together into one big summit. Am I right?
Yeah, so me and James Allen, my colleague, we've been looking very firmly at the energy transition, and we hosted one of these summits, Beyond Oil, back in early 2020. And what happened after that? The incredible returns that came from it were they were a surprise to us how extensive they were and how quick they were. But certainly we knew that they were coming. It's like I said, we're going in a million years, but hopefully soon. And now we're seeing this renewable economic advantage that I have described today is now unlocking decarbonisation in every sector, and it has to. I mentioned that food industry is responsible for 26% of global emissions. The same is true for mining and resources. The same is true for transportation, logistics, aviation, cement, steel, aluminium, all of these things which are so essential. Decarbonisation is now coming for those sectors too. It's expanding out of energy and into the whole global economy as we move into this new world that I describe, where the global economy is being operated in a sustainable fashion. And we wanted to go and speak to some of the experts in that field. You know, this is sustainable investing. We want to speak to the best sustainable investors, authors of the book, technological experts in the disruptive technologies that we're talking about. And so, yeah, James and I, we got together six brilliant speakers. I've interviewed them, and we're going to be releasing them in the form of a summit next week. It's completely free. It starts on Monday, the 14th of March, and I'd love everyone to come and join. There's no obligation, but to the question, what companies do we need to invest in? You may well find an answer if you sign up below.
Well, there you have it, straight from the horse's mouth, folks. The Climate Tech Fortune Summit is something that Kit has been working on behind the scenes for quite a little while now. And you have assembled quite the coterie of experts on this topic exactly. And whatever your thoughts are personally on the renewables sector and on its future, for that matter, there is an awful lot of there's an awful lot of information that you should understand, even if you don't agree with some of the political ambitions of many of the people who push it, because it's pretty much too big to ignore. I mean, Kit, the kind of sums of money that are now getting thrown into renewables is something to behold. I mean, just looking at those figures from Germany, with however many billion that they're thinking of throwing into the renewable sector, even if you disagree with the entire reason for this to exist, the money that can be made as an investor is huge, right?
Yeah, I mean, the figure from last year is that $765 billion got invested in the energy transition in sustainability. And there are now something like $33 trillion invested in sustainable funds, assets, property, stocks, bonds, however you want to talk about it. And all told, the figure going around is that $160 trillion needs to be invested in this by 2050 if we are going to get to this new world that I describe. But one of the problems, and one of the articles that maybe we were going to discuss, Boaz, is that this brilliant idea of investing in the sustainable companies, and I talked a lot about the market response, the market-led solution, about investing in the disruptive technologies that are driving the change. A lot of the industry for getting investments in front of people at home hasn't done this. It's put green on their S&P 500 ETFs. It's put sustainable on their oil and gas funds. It's put ESG, environmental, social, and governance, on their index trackers. And there is a whole host. There are, incredible amounts of funds being launched every year to try and help people invest sustainably. But, even the hundreds and hundreds in America, I saw recently that only 12 actually contain no fossil fuel exposure at all. And you mentioned that people don't have to necessarily align with the ideas or the politics of this. The money flowing into it really tells you that. And I think, our age group, Boaz, us millennials, us softies, we are much more, in general, statistically inclined towards sustainable investing. And something that you and Nick Hubble have spoken brilliantly about is the way demographics has driven, the greatest bull market in history. The last 40 years, as boomers have come into their assets and been investing them, saving for their pensions. You talk a lot about how they're now moving into pension age. They're going to be selling assets down rather than building them up. But their millennial children are going to invest something like $30 trillion over the next 10 to 20 years in inheritance. It's pretty bleak to say, but they are much more inclined towards this segment of investing than anything else. And that demographic, that broad demographic shift, is going to sit behind the $160 trillion that are going into the technologies and the solutions to fight climate change in every single sector. So this is absolutely something people have to be aware of. There's a lot of greenwashing. There's a lot of marketing out there. And, the point of this summit being free and the point of getting the experts in is to make it as educational as possible, to help people to understand, sustainable investing is a personal choice, but they're talking about making weapon sales to Ukraine sustainable.
Yeah.
One man's sword is another man's shield. It's the point is that you want to invest how you want to invest sustainably, and your ethical decisions are your own. What we want to do is to help you find the best technologies and frame the debates in the right way so that you can make those decisions.
Yeah, there are a couple of articles, further articles that I think we could bring up this week, which point to some of the potential pitfalls that await folks who are trying to get into the renewable energy trade as an investor. There was indeed, there were a couple of things which really tarnished the vision of renewable energy and the new world ideal that you described, Kit. When we had weapons companies, I believe Rheinmetall in Germany, saying, could we get a bit of scope here? Yeah, this was it from Bloomberg, asking, can we be counted as ESG? Can we get that ESG green light if we are greenlit as being ESG, we'll be able to get better financing, and you need us to make lots and lots of weapons. I thought it was pretty hilarious myself, though. Of course, it's a bit of gallows humor. Ultimately, Germany's lack of investment in its own defense is pretty, I think it's tragic. I think it's a geopolitical catastrophe. A lot of people think Merkel was a terrific leader, and it's interesting to see how quickly that's changed now that she's left and this crisis has arisen. But I think this example from Bloomberg there with a weapons group saying, can we be ESG? Because if we are ESG, we'll get more financing. It'll be easier for us to meet our contract requirements when it comes to making all of these tanks and bombs that you guys need. And as you mentioned earlier, Kit, during the pandemic, during the first lockdown especially, there was this narrative that arose. We spoke about it earlier, where this is, the pandemic's a big crisis, but suddenly all these politicians came around saying it's our opportunity to build back better. They were all saying build back better. This is an opportunity while we're all locked up at home for us to change the way we consume energy and put huge amounts of money and investment into defeating the climate crisis, et cetera, et cetera. And in this period, there was this enormous swell in every business wanting to be viewed as ESG. Because if you get that ESG green stamp, then you can get included in lots of investment funds that can only invest in ESG funds. So there was not only the creation of lots of ESG only funds, but there were lots and lots of companies that wanted to just get that ESG green stamp. And so this weapons group looking for an ESG green stamp, I think, highlights very strongly how wary a lot of investors should be when you're wanting to invest sustainably or in the renewable sector, and you just look for the ESG sticker, because I don't think the ESG sticker is very reflective, right, Kit?
Yeah, it's a very good point, and the Ukraine example is classic. I mean, I've said this before, and we've battled on Twitter about this very recently. But I think ESG is a very, very good idea that has been done very, very badly. Because the idea is that as investors, what you should do is you should incorporate every single broader risk that you can. And now they're talking about environmental, social, and governance risks. And that means if you're worried about governance, probably don't invest in Russia. That would have warded you away from bad investments in a country that is, in most cases, a kleptocracy. BP, if they thought in this way, might not have owned 20% of Rosneft, which they're now hoping to value down at at a loss of 25 billion. And it doesn't really help investors suddenly when there are a million options, because what they want is simplicity and clarity. And I mentioned before that everything here is subjective, everything changes, and the pathway to net zero is going to be incredibly complicated. So in the 1970s, the Green Movement thought nuclear was a terrible idea. They managed to convince Germany in 2019 or 2011 with Fukushima that it was a terrible idea. But now we realize that cheap zero carbon electricity is significantly better than very expensive high carbon electricity. So we have to recognize that things change, and that what the ESG industry is doing by putting labels and numbers on things isn't helping, because it's trying to make relative things absolute. And I think what we're trying to do with the summit and with our concept of New World Investing is just inform people about the debates on both sides. Divestment is a classic example. A lot of people don't want to own oil and gas companies, and that's entirely fair. But what BP are doing by saying they don't want to own Rosneft, I think they're giving it back to Rosneft for free. That's surely worse. You're giving it to the Russian government. And you have to recognize when you sell it to someone who doesn't care about the fossil fuels that they emit. And then you have to also question, as we've spoken about in this podcast, what the ultimate goal of divestment is, because it seems like it's to push prices up, and it seems like prices going higher is maybe the worst thing that's happening this year. So there's a lot of debate. There's a lot of good reasons to do one thing and a good reason to do the opposite. And I think being informed about both sides, not being absolute, being willing to, I guess, learn about your opposing views. And I hope people appreciate that, although I do believe in BGJ, buy green jumpers, this has been a balanced discussion and recognition of the immense challenges that lie ahead, and that, you know, we're all going to have to change our minds a lot on what is ESG and what is not. So relying on statistical solutions to that particular debate is maybe not the best idea.
Yeah, quite. It does feel to me like there's been an awfully large number of investors and investment funds that have been putting a green jumper on what is otherwise just a regular company or a regular fund.
I'm just a normal guy, Boaz.
Yeah, the everyman Kit Winder,
Every
who is
man in a green jumper.
he's the man to be feared. Clearly, there was this article I thought was quite good on the mis-selling scandal. So it's another thing facing ESG that I think we could take a little look at here. And this was from the FT, and it wasn't this week. It was a couple of weeks back. And green investing, the risk of a new mis-selling scandal. ESG funds are popular, but researchers has found the sector is rife with greenwashing. And there could be all manner of lawsuits in the future when people realize that all the things that they thought were green and sustainable are actually just regular companies that have managed through a little bit of sleight of hand, maybe a little bit of legal accounting changes, and spending a bit of an advertising budget on maybe an advert or some kind of campaign that makes them look really, really respectable, and down with this the new world that we're about to inherit, that will be built back better after the pandemic, when in actuality it was all just a marketing stunt, and they wanted to get in there because if they were counted as ESG, they could absorb a huge amount of capital from these large funds that only can own ESG. You see all these campaigners, students and whatnot, who go after their universities' endowments for owning fossil fuels companies. And I imagine we're going to see a fair bit more of that still in the future. And ultimately, all the companies that could be, the shares could be bought by these enormous funds, well, they want to make sure that they still can be. So they want to look very respectable, but they have actually been greenwashed. Kit, is there any trick that our viewers could remember, any rule of thumb when looking at a company to understand whether or not it is, in fact, a renewable and sustainable company, and it's not something that's just been greenwashed or had a green jumper plonked on it?
Yeah, like me. I think, there's a couple of things. I think the broad question is, does this company make the world a better place? Would the world be better off if this company didn't exist? And again, you can go back to a company like Shell and say, maybe not. Maybe fossil fuels have achieved the greatest economic prosperity in history, but now it's time to move on. So it's good to have that debate and sort of imagining that new world I described, where the global economy is run in a way where humanity can continue to exist and operate as we do indefinitely. Can this company operate in that economy? That's the sort of big question. But I think, there's a lot of ways that ESG, or sustainable, responsible, ethical impact investing, and there's a lot of methods they use, whether it's divestment, avoiding oil and gas companies, whether it's best in class, which means picking the best company in a sector, the most sustainable company in a sector. But what we think is the best strategy is to be well informed about the debates, to know what you want to be investing in, and to invest in the best technologies, the best companies that are driving and benefiting from these huge megatrends in sustainability. We've talked about energy, food, transport, resources. All of these four pillars of our society are moving to a more sustainable operating model. And you want to be investing in the companies that are making that happen and that are going to benefit most from that happening. And that way you can have a greater impact, I believe, and invest more directly and more sustainably. Funds are a difficult way to do that unless you're willing to go all the way through every company, judging each on its merits. And maybe there is a more individual stock selection element to that. And if people don't have the time for that, there's other ways of going about it. But I think investing directly in the drivers of the mega trends is the best way to go, both in terms of the sustainability criteria of what you're doing and in terms of the profitability criteria as well.
Well, there you have it, folks. We have gone a little bit over time for this episode of Southbank Live. But as Kit says, if you're interested in learning more and seeing some of these interviews he's had with some of the top minds in the renewables and the sustainability space, do sign up. There's a link in the description below this video, and you can get it all for free. But Kit, any closing remarks before we depart? We have, as I say, we have gone slightly over time, but we have had a very a balanced discussion, I think. Any last things you'd like to leave with our viewers?
Firstly, thank you, Boaz, for having me on twice in a week. It's always an immense pleasure talking to you, and I hope everyone's enjoyed it. It's a pretty auspicious time to be talking about energy, and it is important to remember that while the energy transition is the long-term goal, at the moment there are some bigger things to worry about, and I understand if that's how people feel. So I'll keep it brief. All I'll say is climate change is much worse than you think, but the fight against it, Boaz, is going much better than you think, and the time is now to get involved, I would say.
There you have it, folks. Once again, if you're interested in learning more, do sign up into the summit, which Kit has arranged. There's just a link below this video. And thanks again to everybody who has tuned in live. As I say, sorry for changing around the times again. We are trying to keep to our Thursday 7 p.m. slot, but we can't always do it. But we shall be back next week, same time, with John Butler again, where we shall be checking in once again with the Ukraine crisis and taking another look at the geopolitical space as we know it. That's all from us for the moment. If you are watching this live, thanks again. And if you're watching a recording, do subscribe and give us a like, as that does help us very much. If you're interested in submitting a question that you'd like us to tackle in a future episode of Southbank Live, do feel free to leave it below in a comment. But that's all from us for the moment, folks. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you in the next one.